If you are the kind of person who is constantly hungry for that next genuine aha moment,
The kind of thing that just totally shifts your perspective.
exactly. If you are insanely curious about the profound mysteries of the universe, but you really want to avoid that awful bogged down feeling of information overload, you have come to the exact right place.
It's so easy to get lost in the weeds with these topics.
It really is. And today we are taking on a topic that has absolutely captivated human imagination for, well, millennia. But before we even get into it, we need to do some mental house cleaning.
Right, sweeping away the preconceptions.
We have to completely strip away the Renaissance paintings of chubby babies with harps. We have to peel back the Hallmark cards, the pop culture stereotypes, the cinematic tropes of guys in trench coats with giant bird wings.
A Hollywood version.
Yeah, we are tossing all of that out the window because today we are diving headfirst into what our actual source materials say about one of the oldest, most fiercely debated mysteries in human history, which is the existence of angels.
It really is a topic that sits right at the very intersection of ancient history, deep theology, human psychology, and, surprisingly enough, theoretical physics.
Which is wild to think about. Physics.
It is. But it's an incredibly rich, dense subject to unpack, largely because humanity has never stopped talking about it. Every culture, every era has some touch point with this exact phenomenon.
Exactly. And the mission for this specific deep dive is, well, it's ambitious. Our goal today is to sift through a massive towering stack of incredibly diverse source materials to see how they collectively combine to build a case.
Or even proof, depending on how you look at the evidence.
Right, a proof for the existence of angels. And when I say diverse, I mean we are pulling from radically different corners of human thought here. We have deeply personal, corroborated eyewitness accounts from authors and pastors like Blake Healy and John Boston.
Those accounts are fascinating.
They really are. And then we contrast that with intense philosophical and skeptical debates from the academic show Closer to Truth. That features heavyweight scholars, guys like J.P. Moreland, Thomas Flint, Dean Radin, Walter Sennett Armstrong, and James Tabor.
It's a heavy-hitting lineup.
Absolutely. And we've got incredibly thorough theological and historical breakdowns from researchers at Mr. Mythos, the Bible Standard, and DLM Christian Lifestyle. And to top it all off, we're bringing in New Age metaphysical and interdimensional perspectives from Teal Swan.
It is a truly fascinating cross-section of human thought. You have your ancient cuneiform texts on one end, your modern, harrowing personal experiences on the other, plus hard-nosed academic skepticism and these expansive metaphysical frameworks.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. Yeah. And our job today is to synthesize this wild array of information. We want to look at not just what these sources claim, but why those claims actually matter to your understanding of reality.
Yeah.
We are going to map out the common denominators across all these different, sometimes heavily conflicting viewpoints to see if a unified theory emerges.
Which is exactly why you're here. You are the perfect guide to help us navigate this massive web of information. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because before we get into the heavy theology or the historical archaeology or, the quantum physics of it all, I feel like we have to start with the most visceral piece of the puzzle.
The human element.
The people, the eyewitness testimony, the personal experiential evidence. We have to look at the people who claim to interact with these beings not as abstract concepts, but as a tangible part of their daily reality.
It grounds the entire discussion.
It does. Let's talk about Blake Healy. In his book and his interview on The Michael Knowles Show, he describes seeing what he identifies as angels and demons for literally his entire life.
Yes, his timeline is quite extraordinary.
Right, and his first memory is incredibly vivid, but also incredibly young.
He recalls these experiences beginning when he was just 2 years old.
2? I mean, I barely remember anything from when I was 2. Maybe a blurry flash of a birthday cake or a toy. But Healy remembers sitting in the backseat of his family's minivan.
A very specific, mundane setting.
Exactly. His mom is up front at a bank drive-through window, and she's playing worship music on the car radio. And Healy remembers looking up and seeing about half a dozen baseball-sized lights drifting back and forth in the air.
Just floating there in the car.
Yeah, but moving in perfect, synchronized time with the music. He said it brought him this overwhelming, profound sense of peace.
Which is a lovely image.
It is, but the source material makes it really clear that his childhood wasn't just filled with peaceful dancing lights. There was a much darker side to his early experiences, too.
Yes, the contrast is quite stark.
He clearly remembers being a young child standing by himself in his parents' lower floor bedroom while they were upstairs in the kitchen having a pretty intense argument.
A high-stress environment for a kid.
Very high stress. And as he's standing there, listening to his parents fight, he looks up and sees this terrifying, pale face literally morphing right out of the ceiling plaster.
Out of the ceiling itself.
Right. He describes it as having sharp, pointed teeth, and it started drifting down toward him. And he reacted the way literally any little kid would. He dove straight into his parents' bed and pulled the covers tightly over his head.
Which, if we pause and look at it from a purely clinical or psychological standpoint, is a very typical childhood reaction to a perceived threat.
Sure, hiding under the covers is classic.
Exactly. A skeptic could easily argue that a 2-year-old seeing lights or a young child experiencing a nightmare-like hallucination during a moment of high familial stress is simply the product of an overactive imagination.
The brain just trying to cope with environmental anxiety.
Precisely. Night terrors and hypnagogic hallucinations are well-documented phenomena in children.
Right, you're falling asleep or waking up and you see things.
Yes. But what makes Healy's account stand out in the source material, and what forces us to look closer, is the sheer persistence and evolution of these visions.
They didn't just stop when he grew up.
They didn't fade away as his brain developed. As he grew older, specifically around age 9, the experiences actually intensified significantly.
Which is terrifying.
He describes seeing a shadowy silhouette standing at the very foot of his bed. This entity had milky white eyes, and its presence literally electrified his body with a feeling of absolute paralyzing panic.
Just frozen in fear.
And this wasn't a one-off bad dream. He claims this specific terrifying encounter happened night after night, relentlessly, for 3.5 years.
3.5 years. Think about the psychological toll of that. For you listening, imagine 3.5 years of waking up to full-blown, terrifying entities in your room.
It would break almost anyone down.
He describes seeing things pulling their own faces apart, seeing hands clawing out from the darkness under his bed. He said he was absolutely terrified that he was, as he put it, a highly functioning schizophrenic.
He was diagnosing himself with a severe mental illness.
Yeah, he thought his brain was just fundamentally broken, but the turning point in his story is fascinating. Eventually, he gets up the courage to confide in his church leaders about what he's experiencing.
A major step for a kid that's scared.
And instead of sending him to a psychiatrist, they introduce him to the biblical concept of seeing in the spirit. This idea that the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds is just, well, thinner for him.
They gave him a completely different paradigm.
And he claims that the moment he understood what he was looking at, the moment he had a framework for it, the paralyzing fear completely vanished.
It's gone.
Gone. He said that suddenly these horrifying demons looked like cheap, plastic Halloween decorations to him. They lost all their power. It completely reframed his reality.
That cognitive shift is incredibly powerful.
It really is. But look, I know Healy's story, as compelling as it is still highly internal. It's his personal vision. So let's look at another experiential account from our sources, one that is violently external.
Something with physical consequences.
Exactly, something life or death. The story of Pastor John Boston from his interview on Hope Channel, this one legitimately gave me chills.
Yes, the Airport Road incident in Columbus, Ohio. It is a profoundly dramatic account of physical survival against seemingly impossible odds.
To put it mildly, let me set the scene for you. John Boston is driving down a busy road. Out of nowhere, another car crosses the center line directly into his lane.
A head-on collision scenario.
Right. So he swerves to avoid it, loses control, and crashes violently into a wooden utility pole. The impact is so severe that the pole literally snaps in half.
The sheer force required for that is immense.
And when it snaps, a massive live electrical transformer plummets down and lands directly on top of his vehicle.
The worst-case scenario.
So he is now trapped inside a crushed car, and thousands upon thousands of volts of raw electricity are coursing through the metal frame. The heat is so intense that the car is literally melting around him.
The physics of that environment are entirely lethal.
He can't touch the doors. He can't move. He is facing absolutely certain horrific death. But then, suddenly, his passenger side door opens.
While the car is electrified.
Exactly. A scruffy-looking man with dirty, grease-stained hands reaches in. The man introduces himself simply as Johnny.
Yeah.
Johnny pulls John Boston out of this electrified, melting wreckage without getting electrocuted himself. He carries Boston about 20 yards away from the intense heat of the car and sets him down safely.
A physical impossibility given the electrical current.
Totally impossible. Johnny looks at him and says, "You're gonna be okay." He then tells Boston that the police are on the way, but that he can't be there when they arrive. And then this guy, Johnny, turns around and completely vanishes.
Gone from the scene.
When the fire department finally arrives, they are absolutely baffled. They look at the wreckage, they look at Boston, and they tell him, you didn't just hit the pole. Based on the physics of this crash, your car went through the pole.
It's an extraordinary claim. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of how we evaluate evidence, it requires us to analyze how experiential testimony is weighed.
Because people can make mistakes in high-stress moments.
Exactly. In a court of law, or in the realm of hard science, a single, isolated eyewitness account is often heavily scrutinized. A skeptic would argue that Boston was in a state of massive physiological shock.
His brain was flooding with adrenaline.
Right, suffering from adrenaline-induced time distortion. And perhaps a good Samaritan did pull him out and simply walked away before the authorities arrived. Trauma does incredible things to human memory.
It can completely rewrite what you think you saw.
It can. But the source material provides a fascinating counterbalance to that baseline skepticism. We have to look at the account of Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland, which was featured on the Closer to Truth program.
Oh, this story is incredible.
His story is crucial because it introduces what essentially mimics the rigorous legal and scientific standard of double-blind corroborated witness testimony.
I want you to break this down for us, because this is where the skeptical argument really starts to sweat.
Moreland recounts an experience where he was invited to speak at a church. He delivers his lecture, and afterwards he is mingling with the attendees. A woman, whom he does not know, approaches him.
Total stranger.
Total stranger. She is hesitant, but she says to him, "You're going to think I'm crazy, but while you were up there speaking, I saw 3 angels standing around you on the stage."
Just casually drops that on him.
Exactly. She said 2 were standing on either side of you, and there was a taller one hovering just over your head. She noted specific details, like the fact that they wore white robes, but she specifically mentioned that she could not make out their faces.
Fascinating detail.
Moreland, being a highly educated philosopher who deals in logic and reason, politely thanks her for her encouraging words, but internally he thinks very little of it.
Right. He basically writes it off entirely. He probably thought, oh, that's a nice lady, but she's just being overly spiritual.
Exactly. He files it away and goes on with his life. But about 8 to 10 months later, Moreland finds himself going through a very difficult, dark, emotional period. He's struggling.
You've all been there.
Lying in bed one night, feeling overwhelmed, he decides to secretly pray. He says to God, "If those angels that woman saw were actually real, please send them back to comfort me right now."
A completely private moment.
Now, this is the critical data point in this account. He tells absolutely no one about this prayer. He hasn't mentioned the woman from Seattle to his colleagues. He hasn't written about her. And he certainly doesn't tell anyone about this desperate late-night internalized request. It exists solely in his own mind.
And then the timing of what happens next is just wild. Less than a week later.
Less than a week later, he receives an unprompted email from one of his graduate students. And Moreland stresses that this is not a student prone to flights of fancy. This is a highly rational, analytical philosophy student.
Someone trained to spot bad logic.
Right. The student writes, "Professor Moreland, I don't know how to tell you this, and I feel strange writing it, but 3 days ago in our lecture class, for about 10 to 15 minutes, I saw 3 angels standing around you.
Wow.
There was one on either side of you and one standing behind you who was taller than you are, looking out over your head."
Okay, stop right there. The exact same configuration. 3 angels, 2 on the sides, 1 taller, 1 in the back. And this grad student had 0 knowledge of the woman from the church 10 months prior and absolutely 0 knowledge of Moreland's private, silent prayer in his bedroom.
Precisely. What's fascinating here is the sheer statistical improbability of that specific configuration being independently hallucinated or fabricated by 2 entirely unconnected individuals.
Separated by almost a year.
Separated by months of time and significant geographical distance, and then aligning perfectly with a secret internalized request. As Moreland argues to the skeptic on the program, if you summarily dismiss that level of corroboration.
If you just wave your hand and say it's a coincidence.
Right. If you do that, you strip away the very foundation of how we rationally conclude that intelligent communication is happening at all. In any other field of inquiry, 2 independent witnesses reporting the exact same anomalous data point without prior collusion would warrant serious investigation, not immediate dismissal.
It really makes you pause. And I want to push back on the skeptics here for a second, because going back to John Boston's story about the car crash, there is a detail that I think is so profoundly important.
The presentation of the entity.
Yes. Boston says he always grew up thinking that if he ever saw an angel, it would have giant, majestic wings and be glowing with this blinding, radiant light. But Johnny was just a scruffy guy with dirty hands.
The mechanic.
Exactly. And Boston had this massive realization later. If you are trapped in a high-voltage car wreck with melting metal, you don't need a glowing being in a pristine white robe. You need a mechanic.
You need someone whose presence makes logical sense in that chaos.
You need someone whose dirty hands prove they can handle the grime, the heat, and the danger of the physical situation. The entity, whatever it was, adjusted its presentation entirely to what the human mind needed to see in that specific moment of crisis.
So that Boston wouldn't completely short-circuit and panic.
Right, which perfectly mirrors what the metaphysical source, Teal Swan, talks about in her material.
It does. Swan's perspective introduces a fascinating elasticity to the concept of angels. She posits that angels are highly adaptable intermediaries.
They aren't fixed in one shape.
No, they do not possess a fixed biological carbon-based form like humans or animals do. Instead, they project themselves or associate themselves with an appearance that will be met with the absolute least amount of psychological resistance by the specific person they are interacting with.
They read the room, essentially.
They are, in essence, pure communication. They utilize forms, aesthetics, and even human personas, like a scruffy mechanic, that will convey their specific message or execute their protective function most effectively for that unique individual.
I really want you, the listener, to think about this for a second. Apply this to your own life. Have you ever had a moment where a complete stranger showed up at the exact right second to help you?
We all have those stories.
Right. Maybe your tire blew out on a dark highway, or you lost your child in a crowd for a terrifying 30 seconds, and someone stepped in, fixed the problem, and then completely disappeared before you could even turn around to say thank you.
Someone who just perfectly blended into the environment.
But performed a task that saved you from total disaster. Based on the synthesis of these sources, could that have been an intervention? It really reframes how you look at the mundane people you pass on the street every single day.
It absolutely shifts the paradigm.
Yes.
It moves the concept of angels away from mythical sky creatures relegated to ancient history and redefines them as active, localized, highly adaptable agents of assistance operating in our present reality.
Which is an amazing thought.
But, as any good researcher knows, this raises a massive, unavoidable question. If they aren't men with bird wings, what are they actually made of?
What is their physical substance?
What is their fundamental nature? And how do they actually operate within the strict laws of physics as we understand them today? This brings us to the metaphysical and interdimensional case presented in our stack of sources.
Yes. Because this is where the deep dive goes, from interesting stories to mind-bending reality shifts. The sources are very, very clear on one thing. The whole wings concept is largely a massive historical misunderstanding.
A symbolic misinterpretation.
Teal Swan explains this beautifully, and it makes so much logical sense. She points out that historically, ancient human beings universally associated God, the divine, and heaven with the sky, simply because it was physically above us.
It was unreachable?
Unreachable, and what was the absolutely only thing ancient people saw that could traverse the gap between the dirt we walk on and the heavens above?
Birds.
So birds became the template.
Wings became this potent universal shorthand, a symbol of ascending to the heavens, of divine power, and of delivering messages over vast, impossible distances. They were like divine carrier pigeons.
The imagery was functional. The wings were never meant to be a literal biological description. They were symbolic representations to help limited ancient minds grasp the concept of an intermediary between the physical earth and the non-physical divine realm.
It is a problem of translation across eras. According to Swan, and this aligns with several modern theological interpretations in our sources, angels are essentially vast consciousnesses that hold an intermediary perspective.
Meaning they sit between worlds.
Exactly. They exist in a state between the temporal, highly restricted physical world we inhabit and the non-temporal, non-physical source of creation. She claims their perspective is not limited to our standard 4 dimensions of space-time.
Our length, width, depth, and linear time.
Right. Depending on the specific class or hierarchy of the angel, she suggests they can perceive anywhere from 5th to 11th dimensional awareness.
11th dimensional.
They can conceptualize the multitude of potential timelines branching out from any given moment, seeing the beginning and the end simultaneously.
Okay, I want to pause here because this is heavy. Let's do an explain it like I'm 5 for this dimensional stuff. Are you saying it's kind of like that old thought experiment Flatland?
That is a perfect analogy.
Like if we are completely flat, 2D stick figures drawn on a piece of paper, we only know length and width. We have absolutely no concept of up.
The 3rd dimension doesn't exist to us.
Right. And if a 3D object, like an apple, suddenly falls through our piece of paper, we wouldn't see an apple. We would just see a completely inexplicable circle magically appearing out of nowhere, growing larger, and then shrinking to nothing as the apple passes through our flat reality.
Just a series of shifting 2D shapes.
Is that what we were talking about with these higher dimensional beings?
That is precisely the analogy physicists use to explain M-theory and higher spatial dimensions, and it perfectly applies to the theology we are examining.
It bridges the gap.
If an entity exists in, let's say, a 5th dimensional space, it inherently has complete access to the dimensions below it, our 3D world, in ways that seem entirely like magic or miracles to us lower dimensional inhabitants.
Because we can't see the whole picture.
We only see the slice of their reality that intersects with our 3D plane.
Which is where it gets really interesting, because when you take that modern theoretical physics concept of higher dimensional awareness and you apply it backward to ancient, thousands of years old biblical texts, well, suddenly, the most bizarre, trippy descriptions of angels make terrifying, perfect sense.
The texts start to read like primitive science reports.
Exactly. Let's look at the Mr. Mythos deep dive into the biblical prophet Ezekiel. I love this source. Ezekiel is a captive slave in Babylon. He is sitting by the Chabar River, exhausted, and suddenly the heavens open up.
He has massive vision.
But he doesn't see a chubby baby with a harp. He doesn't see a guy with swan wings. He sees the Ophanim, the 3rd choir of angels.
Yes, Ezekiel's description is notoriously one of the most alien, psychedelic, and incomprehensible passages in all of ancient literature.
He is struggling for words.
He struggles deeply to find the words. He describes creatures that are essentially intersecting wheels, a wheel within a wheel. He notes that their rims are high and awesome, and that these rims are completely covered in eyes all around.
Wheels covered in eye.
Furthermore, he makes a very specific, mechanically baffling observation about how they move. He says they speed back and forth like flashes of lightning, but the wheels themselves never change direction when they move.
They move without turning.
They move without turning.
I mean, if you were sitting by a river and you saw a glowing, spinning gyroscope of eyeballs moving without turning, you would be absolutely terrified. You would think you were losing your mind.
Which is exactly why the single most common phrase spoken by angelic beings in ancient texts is "fear not."
Right, don't panic.
Their natural state is inherently terrifying to the human brain. But if we take your flatland analogy and look at Ezekiel's description through the lens of modern mathematics and interdimensional physics, it entirely ceases to be a psychedelic hallucination.
That becomes geometry.
It becomes a surprisingly accurate, desperate attempt to describe higher dimensional geometry. Imagine a 4-dimensional object, a hypercube or a tesseract, intersecting with our 3-dimensional space.
Just pushing through our paper.
To a 3D observer, a 4D object moving through our space would appear visually confusing, geometrically impossible, and seemingly self-intersecting. It would look exactly like a complex structure of wheels that are somehow moving and changing position without actually turning in the 3D space it occupies.
It's like the ancient prophets were just desperately trying to describe theoretical physics using the profoundly limited vocabulary of a Bronze Age shepherd.
They did the best with the words they had.
They didn't have the words tesseract or hypercube or quantum superposition. They had wheels within wheels. And the eyes. The fact that it was covered in eyes could just be Ezekiel's way of describing an entity that possesses 360-degree omnidirectional awareness.
If you are a 4D being, you can see all sides of a 3D object at once.
You can see the inside of a closed box. To Ezekiel, an entity that can see everything at once is just covered in eyes.
Exactly. It removes the need for magic entirely and replaces it with advanced physics. This interdimensional framework perfectly explains the mechanics of the miracles attributed to angels in the texts.
Give us an example.
Consider the book of Acts in the New Testament. The Apostle Peter is chained between guards inside a locked prison cell. An angel allegedly enters this sealed environment, causes the chains to simply fall off, and leads Peter out through locked iron gates.
Right. If you are a 3D person, a locked box is completely sealed. The only way in is to break the physical lock. But if you have fourth-dimensional access, the concept of a 3D enclosure is totally irrelevant.
You bypass the barrier completely.
You can just reach around the 3D walls of the box from a higher dimension and pull the item out, or in Peter's case, unlatch the door from an angle that literally does not exist in our 3D reality.
It's elegant, really.
It explains how they can appear out of thin air, how they can shape-shift into a scruffy mechanic like Johnny in Ohio, and how they can purportedly see the future. Because if time is just another physical dimension to them, they are operating outside the linear one-way flow of our timeline.
They can look at our timeline the way we look at a ruler sitting on a desk.
They see the whole ruler.
This interdimensional framework provides a remarkably elegant logical structure. It unites ancient theology with modern theoretical concepts in a way that respects both disciplines.
It gives both sides a seat at the table.
But theoretical frameworks and mathematical analogies are only one pillar of the proof we are trying to build today. If these beings interact with our world, they should leave a mark. We also must examine the physical historical record left behind in the dirt.
The actual archaeology.
This brings us to a major body of evidence in our sources, the historical and textual anomalies.
Yes, let's leave the quantum physics for a minute and look at the hard history, the dirt and the stones. We are jumping into the source material from the Bible Standard, which takes a deep look at a massive geopolitical event during the reign of King Hezekiah in Jerusalem.
A pivotal moment in ancient history.
The kingdom of Judah was in absolute peril. They were being systematically devastated by the Assyrian Empire. And we need to be clear about who the Assyrians were. They were the undisputed, brutal, technologically advanced superpower of the ancient world.
They were terrifying.
They were essentially the Roman Empire before the Roman Empire existed, and they were famous for psychological warfare and utter ruthlessness. King Sennacherib of Assyria marches his massive, undefeated army to Jerusalem and lays a total siege to it.
Cutting off all escape.
The city is completely surrounded, supply lines are cut, the people are starving. It looks like the complete, inevitable end of the Jewish people. But the biblical account says that Hezekiah prays, and in one single night the angel of the Lord went out into the Assyrian camp and wiped out 185,000 soldiers.
It is a staggering claim of mass destruction. To lose 185,000 troops overnight without a conventional battle is unheard of in ancient military history.
Unimaginable.
Naturally, for centuries, secular historians viewed this as purely religious propaganda, a myth invented by a conquered people to salvage their pride.
Staggering. But here is the crazy part, the part that absolutely blew my mind when reviewing the sources. This isn't just an isolated story in a religious text. We actually have the archaeological receipts.
The physical proof.
Break down the secular proof for us.
Okay.
Tell us about the Taylor Prism.
The Taylor Prism is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. It is a six-sided baked clay artifact discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, which was Sennacherib's capital city.
His home base.
It is currently housed behind glass in the British Museum in London. On this prism, carved meticulously in cuneiform script, Sennacherib documents his military conquests. He is incredibly detailed.
He's bragging.
He brags about taking 46 fortified cities of Judah, listing the plunder, the slaves, the livestock. And regarding King Hezekiah in Jerusalem, Sennacherib's own royal scribes carved the words that he shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage.
Like a bird in a cage. That is such a specific, arrogant taunt. He is officially, in the historical record, bragging about having the king completely trapped and powerless.
Yes, but that is exactly where the Assyrian record abruptly, inexplicably ends.
It just stops.
The prism completely omits any description of actually conquering Jerusalem. It omits any mention of capturing Hezekiah, executing him, or taking the ultimate prize of the city's wealth.
Which is the whole point of a siege.
And most glaringly, it fails to offer any strategic explanation as to why the greatest military superpower on Earth, having successfully surrounded a deeply weakened, starving enemy capital, suddenly and inexplicably abandoned the siege.
They just left.
They retreated hundreds of miles all the way back to Nineveh in disgrace, where, the historical record notes, Sennacherib was shortly after assassinated by his own sons in a temple.
Secular historians cannot explain it. It makes zero strategic sense. Why do you march your entire vast army across the ancient world, spend immense resources to lay siege, successfully trap the rival king like a bird in a cage, and then just, well, Pack up your tents and run away home without taking the city.
It defies military logic.
What could possibly scare away an undefeated army?
When you synthesize the secular history with the biblical history, a fascinating picture emerges. The Assyrians, like many ancient empires, were notorious for recording only their victories. Ancient kings rarely, if ever, documented their humiliating defeats in stone.
They just erase the bad parts.
So the sudden silence on the Taylor Prism speaks volumes. The sudden catastrophic loss of 185,000 troops perfectly fills the historical void.
It's the missing puzzle piece.
An intervention by a highly powerful, destructive entity in this case, identified in the Hebrew text as an angel, acts as a logically sound placeholder for an entirely unsolved historical mystery. It bridges the gap between Assyrian arrogance and Assyrian retreat.
And looking at the texts themselves changes how we read history, too. On the Closer to Truth program, scholar James Tabor provides some incredible textual insight that I think clears up a lot of confusion.
Linguistic context.
He points out that the original Hebrew word used in the ancient texts is malach, and malach simply means messenger. That's it. It doesn't mean a glowing guy with a halo. It doesn't mean a winged creature.
It describes a job, not a species.
It was a functional title, and it was used completely interchangeably. If King David sent a human guy on a horse to deliver a letter to a general, that human guy was a malach.
A human messenger.
If God sent an interdimensional entity to wipe out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, that entity was also a malach. The concept of the winged, majestic creature is a much later addition to the theology, heavily influenced by Greek and Roman art.
Tabor's etymological point is crucial for this deep dive because it fundamentally demystifies the text.
It strips away the fantasy.
It grounds these ancient encounters not as fairy tales or myths, but as functional, bureaucratic reports of agents carrying out directives. Whether those agents were human or non-physical, their primary attribute was their mission, their function, not their morphology. They were identified by what they did, not what they looked like.
Which is such a wild thing to consider when you look at the broad sweep of human history. We all know the saying that history is written by the victors. Or, in Sennacherib's case, history is written to strategically hide a massive, inexplicable, supernatural defeat.
A cover-up in clay.
It really makes you, the listener, wonder, if you look back through human history, how many other bizarre anomalies are there? Sudden reversals of fortune in massive battles, inexplicable survival stories of explorers,
Events that pivot on a dime.
sudden shifts in global events that might have non-physical interdimensional explanations, but historians just gloss over them or chalk them up to luck or weather because an angelic intervention simply doesn't fit the rigid materialist worldview of modern academia.
Which is the perfect pivot to the next major perspective we need to analyze. Because in any rigorous deep dive, we cannot simply accept the supernatural or interdimensional explanations, no matter how elegant they seem, without giving equal serious weight to the skeptical, scientific, and psychological alternatives.
We have to look at the other side.
If we want to build a true proof, it must withstand scrutiny. And the Closer to Truth source material provides a very robust, articulate counter-argument.
Absolutely. We have to play devil's advocate here, or maybe in this case, angel's advocate. Let's talk about the strictly materialist, skeptical view presented by philosopher Walter Sinnott Armstrong.
His approach is deeply grounded in biology.
His argument is essentially, let's apply Occam's razor. We don't need to invent 11th dimensional mathematics or invisible agents to explain angels. We can explain them using biology and evolutionary psychology.
He points to internal physical causes.
For example, he points to purely biological quirks. He mentions floaters in the eyes, those little pieces of cellular debris that cast shadows on your retina, which we all get. The tiny squiggles you see when looking at a bright sky.
Right. He argues that if you are a human being alone, terrified in the dark, or in a state of high stress, your brain's hyperactive agency detection software might interpret that biological shadow drifting across your vision as a ghost, a demon, or an angel.
The brain is trying to find patterns to keep you safe.
He argues that angels are essentially profound psychological coping mechanisms. They are hallucinations deeply shaped by our shared cultural motivations. As a species, we all want to feel protected. We all desperately want an explanation for the random evil, illness, and suffering in the world.
We crave order,
So human cultures collectively invent these beings to seek comfort and order in a chaotic universe.
Senator Armstrong's argument is well-reasoned and relies on the premise that a shared psychological need will produce shared cultural myths. And to be fair, that accounts perfectly well for the comforting aspect of angels, the feeling of a guardian angel when you narrowly avoid a car accident.
When you just have a feeling of safety.
However, his materialist biological model struggles significantly when confronted with the terrifying, highly specific, corroborated visions we discussed earlier.
Like the graduate student.
Exactly. A floater in the eye does not explain J.P. Moreland's graduate student seeing the exact same three entities in the exact same spatial configuration as a woman 10 months prior. It doesn't explain physical interactions like John Boston being pulled from a crushed car.
You can't hallucinate someone pulling you from a wreck.
But another scholar on that same program, Dean Radin, offers a truly fascinating middle ground that bridges the gap between hard skepticism and pure theology.
This part is incredible.
Radin is an ESP and parapsychology researcher, and he posits that even if angels are not independent, divine beings created by a god before the dawn of time, they might still exist in a very real way as massive, tangible projections of the collective unconscious.
Yes. Okay, this concept absolutely blew my mind when I was reading through the notes, the idea of an intersubjective reality. We really need to unpack the implications of this.
Radin suggests that humanity shares a deeply connected quantum mental space. We are not isolated islands of consciousness.
Our minds are linked.
If millions of people over thousands of years pour their intense intentions, their deepest fears, their fervent prayers, and their desperate desires into the concept of protective spirits or demonic forces, the collective human consciousness might literally possess the power to manifest these beings into a shared reality.
We think them into existence.
In occult and esoteric studies, this is sometimes referred to as a tulpa or an egregore, a thought form made real by sheer collective belief. Radin refers to related concepts like place memory,
where a location holds on to feelings.
where the physical substrate of an environment like the stone walls of an ancient castle, a centuries-old church, or perhaps a bloody battlefield acts almost like magnetic tape, absorbing the intense emotional and psychic information of the humans who suffered or triumphed there.
It records the trauma or the joy.
When someone new walks into that space, their own mind resonates with that stored information, and their brain decodes it by perceiving a spirit or an entity.
I want to make sure I'm grasping the gravity of this. What's fascinating here is that even the skeptics and the parapsychology researchers in our sources aren't entirely denying the actual phenomenon of angels.
They acknowledge the experiences are happening.
They aren't saying all these people across history are just lying or crazy. They are just relabeling the mechanics of how the entities get here. The theological sources say an external creator made them. But Radin's theory suggests humanity's collective mind is acting almost like a massive global 3D printer.
Consciousness printer.
We are manifesting these beings out of sheer intention into a tangible, shared mental space that we can all bump into. But think about the implications of that. If human belief creates reality, if our consciousness is that powerful, what else are we unwittingly manifesting?
It turns our thoughts into physical forces.
It makes the idea of negative thinking or collective cultural fear physically dangerous.
It is a profound paradigm shift. It suggests that consciousness itself, rather than physical matter, is the fundamental bedrock of reality. It means we are active participants in creating the spiritual ecosystem around us.
We are co-creators.
But regardless of their ultimate origin point, whether they were divinely created before the dawn of humanity to serve God, or whether they were collectively manifested by the sheer force of human consciousness over millennia, the sources uniformly agree on one vital point.
That they impact our daily lives.
The effects of these entities are tangibly, measurably felt in our world. And if they are real and active, we have to understand how they operate. What are the rules of their ecosystem? Because it's clearly not a chaotic free-for-all.
No, it is highly structured. Which brings us to a massive chunk of our deep dive, the mechanics, the rules, and the dark side. Because if you thought the spinning interdimensional wheels with eyes were intense, just wait until we get into the actual bureaucracy of heaven.
It is an incredibly detailed system.
From the Mr. Mythos source, which draws heavily on medieval theology and texts like Pseudo-Dionysius, we get a detailed breakdown of the 9 choirs of angels. It turns out the angelic realm is intensely organized. It's not just a bunch of guys in white robes floating around playing harps.
Far from it.
It is a rigid military, administrative, and cosmic hierarchy divided into 3 distinct spheres.
It is essentially the operational organizational chart of the entire cosmos. The first sphere, which is positioned closest to the immediate presence of God or the source, consists of the seraphim, the cherubim, and the aphanim.
Inner circle.
The seraphim are described as the burning ones, creatures of pure light and heat constantly worshiping, and in ancient texts, they are sometimes associated with fiery flying serpents or dragons.
Dragons. That's a far cry from a Hallmark card.
The cherubim, which as we noted are far from the chubby babies of Renaissance art, are described as terrifying chimeras with multiple faces, often a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle.
All meshed together.
And their primary function is to act as the fierce guardians of highly sacred spaces, such as the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And the aphanim, of course, are the interdimensional wheels we discussed earlier with Ezekiel.
Okay, so that's the inner circle. Then you drop down to the second sphere, which is basically the middle management of the universe. You have the dominions, the virtues, and the powers.
The cosmic operators.
And their job is fascinating. They manage the physical laws of the universe. They keep the stars burning. They manage the orbits of planets, the changing of seasons, the laws of gravity. But the powers in this sphere are explicitly described as warrior angels, the destroyer angels.
The military branch.
These are the heavy hitters. These are the ones who wipe out armies, like the 185,000 Assyrian soldiers we talked about. They are the cosmic enforcers. And finally, you get to the third sphere, which is the one that actually interacts with us down here on the ground.
The boots on the ground, so to speak.
The principalities, the archangels like Michael and Gabriel who carry massive messages, and the guardian angels who are assigned to individual humans.
This exhaustive hierarchy reveals a very structured, purposeful ecosystem. Every entity has a function. But within this ecosystem, the sources present a fascinating, deeply profound theological contradiction regarding their fundamental nature.
A huge debate.
And this contradiction strikes the heart of human philosophy. The Bible Standard Source argues firmly that angels, being immortal spirit creatures created by God, literally cannot die. And because ancient theology dictates that the wages of sin is death, if an entity cannot die, it therefore cannot sin.
They are incapable of doing wrong.
According to this rigid view, the popular concept of fallen angels, or a cosmic rebellion in heaven, is entirely false. They are perfect, unyielding, almost robotic servants of the divine will. They execute orders flawlessly.
But practically every other source we looked at vehemently disagrees with that assessment. DLM Christian Lifestyle, Pastor John Boston, and Mr. Mythos all heavily cite the narrative found in Revelation and other texts of a massive cataclysmic war in heaven.
A civil war among the angels.
They assert that angels were not created as robots, but with absolute free will, just like humans, and that a third of the angelic host, led by an entity known as Lucifer, used that free will to rebel against the established cosmic order, resulting in them being cast down into our dimensional space.
This contradiction is not just a trivial debate over ancient lore or fantasy world building. It carries immense, staggering theological weight regarding the nature of the universe we live in.
It changes everything about how we view evil.
It is the ultimate debate between determinism and free will. If angels can fall, if they can choose to rebel, it indicates that the Creator's universe is fundamentally built on the absolute principles of liberty, choice, and voluntary love, rather than programmed, forced servitude.
God wants them to choose to be good.
It means God values free will so highly that he is willing to allow conflict, rebellion, and warfare in his own home to preserve it. Conversely, if angels cannot sin, as the Bible Standard argues, it shifts the origin of evil entirely away from the spiritual realm and places the terrifying burden of all evil squarely onto humanity's shoulders.
That is incredibly heavy to think about. But if we follow the vast majority of our sources which do support the existence of fallen angels or demons, we have to look at how they actually operate in our daily lives.
The mechanics of the dark side.
Blake Healy, the man who saw the terrifying shadow entities for years, makes a crucial observation. He describes demons not as powerful dark creators who can build things from scratch, but purely as scavengers.
They are parasites.
They cannot create anything new. They just exploit pre-existing negative human emotions. If you are feeling a little lonely, a little angry, or isolated, they latch on to that tiny vulnerability and try to spin it out of control, whispering lies to magnify your despair.
He fanned the flames of what's already there.
And John Boston noted something strikingly similar from his theological perspective. He said the true power of a demon isn't some cool supernatural magic trick. It's the sheer blinding audacity to fight against the creator of the universe. It's an entity built entirely on deception and illusion.
And this deceptive, exploitative, parasitic nature doesn't just operate on a personal individual level. According to the sources, It scales up.
It gets much bigger.
It operates on a massive macro scale as well. This brings us to the concept of principalities, which we briefly mentioned in the third sphere of the hierarchy. In the theological framework, principalities are high-level entities that do not care about individual humans.
They are looking at the big picture.
Instead, they oversee, influence, and manipulate entire regions, nations, or massive cultural and political movements.
Right, and to illustrate how these principalities supposedly operate, we have to share a very specific modern vision from Blake Healy. Now, before we describe this, we must state strictly and unequivocally that we are merely reporting Healy's vision verbatim from his source material.
It is essential we make that clear.
We, as hosts of this deep dive, take absolutely no political stance on this whatsoever. We are not endorsing one side or the other. This is purely an examination of his experiential claim to understand the scavenger mechanic of these entities.
Understood. The neutrality is important. Let's look at the mechanics of the claim.
Healy claims that during the highly tumultuous year of 2020, he had a vivid spiritual vision of two massive, high-level demonic principalities operating over the entire nation. He said they were virtually identical entities standing side by side, and they were both wearing crowns.
Twin entities.
On the front of one crown was written the word Democrat, and on the front of the other crown was written the word Republican. But here is the massive twist that reveals their nature. When he looked closer in the vision, he saw that the entity wearing the Republican crown had the word Democrat written on the back of its head.
He was two-faced.
And the entity wearing the Democrat crown had the word Republican written on the back of his head. Healy interpreted this to mean that these high-level entities were essentially playing both sides of the board.
Pitting people against each other.
They don't care at all about the actual political ideologies, the policies, or the politicians. They are a unified, parasitic force that feeds exclusively on human division, outrage, tribalism, and conflict. And again, we are strictly reporting the source material here to illustrate the concept of parasitic spiritual manipulation.
The analytical value of that vision, completely regardless of one's own political affiliation, is how perfectly and elegantly it illustrates the scavenger concept on a national scale.
It's an efficiency model.
If these entities exist as described, their ultimate goal is simply to extract energy by exacerbating existing human fractures. They don't need to generate the opposing political views or the complex socioeconomic issues. They simply identify the fault lines in human society and exploit the vitriol, turning natural human disagreement into absolute hatred. It is an efficiency model of spiritual warfare.
So after going through all of this, what does this all mean for us? When you take the 9 choirs, the terrifying Ezekiel wheels, the guardian angels, the demonic scavengers, the massive political principalities.
It's an overwhelming amount of data.
The angelic realm, according to the totality of these sources, is not a fairy tale. It is a highly structured, intensely bureaucratic, deeply active ecosystem that is layered invisibly directly over our own physical reality.
It's functioning parallel to us.
It's like a massive operating system running silently in the background of a computer, managing the hardware, enforcing the code, fighting off viruses, and occasionally, when absolutely necessary, sending a direct, life-saving message to the user.
That is an exceptionally apt analogy. As we synthesize this deep dive and look at the massive stack of information we've covered, we are left with a profoundly complex, deeply challenging picture of reality.
It really challenges your baseline assumptions.
We began with an ambitious mission to see how these radically diverse sources might combine to build a cohesive proof for the existence of angels. And what we found is a multi-angle framework that is surprisingly robust.
The pieces fit together.
We have corroborated statistically improbable, double-blind eyewitness accounts like J.P. Moreland's experience with his graduate student. We have hard, physical, secular archaeological anomalies like the Taylor Prism that leave historical gaps perfectly sized for divine or interdimensional intervention.
The puzzle pieces from history.
We have advanced theoretical interdimensional physics that elegantly explain the seemingly magical, impossible mechanics of ancient biblical texts. And we have the modern psychological and ESP models from researchers like Dean Radin that suggest even if they aren't traditional divine beings, they are real, tangible, measurable projections of our collective human consciousness.
It covers all the bases.
When all of these threads are woven together, these sources build a compelling, multidisciplinary case that humanity is absolutely not acting alone on this stage.
And that right there is the ultimate takeaway for you, listening right now. Whether you are an absolute skeptic who views angels purely as collective consciousness projections fueled by millennia of human belief,
A psychological phenomena.
or a science enthusiast who views them as fourth-dimensional entities operating outside of our linear time, or someone who views them as literal, structured agents of a divine creator fighting scavengers in an unseen realm. The sources, across all disciplines, point to the exact same conclusion.
We are accompanied.
You are constantly surrounded by an unseen support system. You are navigating a world that is far more mysterious, far more deeply layered, and far more intimately connected than just the physical objects you can touch with your hands.
It fundamentally, undeniably changes how you interact with reality on a daily basis. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on the synthesis of the source material we've explored today.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time discussing how angels might be fourth, fifth, or even 11th dimensional beings, perfectly navigating our 3D world, seeing inside our locked boxes without us ever perceiving them. But if we flip that paradigm,
Flip it half.
what does that say about human consciousness itself? If a person like Blake Healy can suddenly learn to perceive them, or if thousands of seemingly normal people across history have interacted with them, are our own minds actually multidimensional receivers that are just temporarily trapped inside a limited 3D biological body?
Oh, wow.
Are we in our moments of intuition, our deep dreams, or our sudden flashes of unexplainable peace, constantly catching fleeting glimpses of a higher dimensional reality that we were already a fundamental part of, but just haven't learned how to fully tune our dials to yet?
Oh, man. That is absolutely going to keep me up tonight. Are we already living in the fourth dimension, just wearing 3D biological blinders? I love that thought. We are part of the system. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive today. Keep your eyes open to the unseen world around you. Always treat the strangers you meet kindly, because you truly never know if they have dirty hands for a cosmic reason. And we will catch you on the next one.